Thanks for joining us at the Business Growth Cafe, where each week we select from a menu of topics for a focused discussion with an industry expert to provide insights that can impact your business's growth. With your host, Angelo Ponzi.
I am Angelo Ponzi, and thank you for stopping by the Business Growth Cafe today. We have an interesting show. We have a psychologist on, but just not any psychologist. I'm glad I didn't say psychiatrist, but psychologist, right? We're not laying on any couches today. She is a psychologist for business, and more importantly, in the tech world, and helping tech entrepreneurs and business leaders that are more kind of focused on the technical side of business, helping to become better communicators, better leaders within their organization. So on the show, I have Dr. Joanie Connell, and she is going to help us understand how companies can do a better job in making sure they're communicating not only to their customers, but internally to their staffs as well. Now, as you'll hear in the interview, Joanie was an engineer who turned psychologist. So that's an interesting transition all the way along, and I think you're going to find this fascinating. There's a lot of interesting insights that we're going to learn today about how to become better leaders, how to be better communicators, and to making sure that we create an environment where everybody is thriving within the organization. So don't go away. First of all, I'm going to talk to you about what it's like to work with a fractional CMO like myself.
A chief marketing officer has both the power and the responsibility to drive long-term strategic growth that can ultimately lead to organizational prosperity. And that growth starts with a vision. What is your firm's definition of success? Growth? How will you strategically work towards expansion, for example? Equally important, what is your customer's perception of your firm? And how well do you meet a need or deliver value? When you begin to align your vision with that of your customer, you build a stronger, lasting relationship with them. You see the whole picture, realizing the lifetime value of that customer, as well as the lifetime value you provide. A CMO must look at success with a strategic mindset, looking beyond the transactional. The CMO must understand the customer journey, utilizing the competitive intelligence, embracing and leveraging your unique market insights. If your business is ready for growth and you need a CMO, but you're not quite ready for a full-time person yet, I'd welcome the opportunity to explore the benefits of using a fractional CMO. Visit theponzigroup.com to learn more.
As I mentioned, I have Dr. Joanie Connell on the line today. She is going to be joining us, and we're going to have a great time really digging into a lot of great insights and recommendations and observations and all those other wonderful things that she's going to bring to the party today. So Joanie, welcome to the Business Growth Cafe.
Thank you, Angelo. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you for stopping by. It is morning time, and I do have my cup of coffee. Sometimes I do these later in the evening, and my coffee becomes a glass of wine or a whiskey. But other than that, I am at the cafe today having a coffee. I wish I had a croissant. Because my wife's not around and she won't tell me not to eat it. So why don't we start off to put things in context for the audience? Why don't you tell them about yourself and your business and anything else you want to share to kind of kick things off?
Sure. I'll give you a little background. I started out, my first career was as an electrical engineer up in Silicon Valley. I say up because I'm down now in San Diego. I worked as an engineer designing circuits for several years and found that I was just much more interested in the people than the circuitry. And it took me several years, but over time I decided to go back to graduate school and study psychology to become an organizational consultant. And that's what I've been doing for over 20 years since. Now I focus primarily on consulting to technical leaders and teams, but I work with all sorts of different folks, and I help them communicate and manage teams, develop leadership skills. And I love working with technical people, engineers, scientists, and other tradespeople, because I get them and they get me, and it builds credibility. And I'm very analytical myself, coming from an engineering background. And so we tend to walk through sort of a tools-based approach to focusing on some of the softer things which sometimes are uncomfortable for folks. So my company is Flexible Work Solutions, and it is a small company. We tend to partner with folks, bringing in larger groups as necessary for projects, do a lot of custom work for organizations. And it's been really fun. I work a lot of virtual teams. I've been doing that for 20 years, way before the pandemic hit, but also in person. So coaching, consulting, training, mostly, that's pretty much it.
Okay. It's interesting. You said way before the pandemic, you were doing it virtually, as I had been doing it. And same thing, working remotely. Mm-hmm. And so I actually, not that I'm endorsing the pandemic, but, I found during that time, it was just natural for me. It was just business as usual, where a lot of people were just panicking and how to communicate and the technology and being at home and, close to the family or the refrigerator, depending on how you wanted to look at it. I talked to some people the other day that, we're talking about putting on the COVID-19, like the college 15 or whatever that is.
Oh, right. Yes.
But refrigerator was too close. So it was always closed for me. But it's not something I went to. So engineer turned psychologist, not was that a big change? Was that like a natural thing? I mean, I talk about tech speak, and I've worked with technical people throughout life, and I'm glad we're having this conversation, because a lot of times, like, do you not understand the words that are coming out of my mouth?
Right. I get the puzzled look quite often. Wow, engineer, psychologist, that's unusual. I've met a few in my lifetime, but not many. Was it natural? I think it is in a lot of ways, because it's understanding how things or people work. And that's how I see psychology, is understanding how people work. And, fixing people, well, people kind of have to fix themselves more than you fixing them, which is an interesting conversation for engineers. But understanding what makes people tick. I do a lot of assessment work as well, helping to hire folks, decide if they fit the job. And so that's a lot of similar work as engineering. And I think one of the things that I bring to the table is I'm more systematic, data-driven than some other folks who approach psychology from a more therapeutic or feelings orientation. And so I use tools and systems that are research-based, evidence-based, and people appreciate that, especially in the technical world. But it is different. It's a different side of the brain to really talk about empathy and understanding people and appreciating that. And having a foot in both worlds is, it's a fun place to be, because I feel like a bit of a translator, liaison, communication specialist a lot.
Who typically brings you in? I mean, I look at whether is the leader of the company from the technical side and they're having trouble communicating to other folks within their organization, or or a leader who's like, I'm talking to them, I'm not sure, speaking the same language. How does it, is it chicken and the egg? How does that work for you to kind of get into the ideal client?
Ideally, the technical leader will come to me because they realize they either have a new opportunity, like a new team, or they're expanding and on their people leadership skills, or they're reaching a limit of their own training and development and saying, I need to do something different and I need to learn how to do it. But more often, it's somebody from the C-suite or director level calling me, or an HR leader calling me saying, we have this technical leader. It could be a scientist or an engineer or somebody else who's extremely valuable to the company, right? They're so good. They are, we can't lose them, yet they're having trouble with XYZ problem. It could be they got a team now and they are micromanaging and they just can't let go. They are being very defensive in meetings and they're not taking feedback from anybody else. It could be that they are just so hands-on. They're not actually doing the leadership. They want to continue doing the work themselves. So those are some of the typical problems. But it's better, of course, when the person acknowledges it themselves and reaches out. But sometimes that's hard to do. I mean, for any of us, not just technical people.
Right. Well, to admit that you have an issue, I think in general, right?
Yeah.
To say I don't. I think from a lot of leadership, and I've dealt with a lot of folks in that, when you talk to them, they don't believe they have a problem, right? It's everybody else's problem. And I would assume that's part of what you do, is to get them to understand and how their role, and these are more soft skills, right?
Yeah, I would say a lot of them are soft skills. We have the business side and the people side and the technical side. I like to think of it as a three-pronged approach. Right? You need all three. It's hard to find all three in one person. And so when you have three different people or two different people trying to focus on those three areas, you need to be able to communicate with each other.
Well, I would think too, having that kind of three-legged approach, right? You need, if you only have two, the stool's going to fall over.
Right.
But that would help in your recruiting side, is really looking at those three tools, if you will, of making sure the right person when you're helping to assist in maybe a hiring situation.
Yeah, I mean, that's often when you get to the leadership level, what makes or breaks a person in that position is not just that their skills and abilities as a leader and the people side of it, but their willingness and openness to learn and take feedback and grow.
Do you find that when you're brought in, there's resistance?
Sometimes, absolutely. I've had some leaders who are very resistant, and that can take a while to build the trust. That's typically what it is, and help them see the value of what I'm providing to them, and helping them understand that that there is a value to being able to change, in that they don't have to be somebody new. And it's not necessarily a criticism of who they are. It's a development and who they can be and be even more, rather than taken away. So that's often the beginning when people are resistant. And the resistance shows up in a few different ways. It can be just people avoid talking to you, cancel meetings all the time. When you have a session, it can be they want to see the data. Well, show me the data that proves that I'm doing something wrong. It can be skeptical. Oh, what are you offering? What kind of tools are you using? They don't seem like they really are valid or have anything. And focusing on those kind of issues rather than the big picture of, you've got a team of people who are struggling and they're underperforming. How can we help you and the team improve?
So almost they take it personally. When that happens, right? Yeah. And it's interesting you say, of course, the technical people go to the data. Show me the data, and trying to understand that, how you can use that where it isn't necessarily database per se as much as performance based. Yeah, sometimes using the numbers helps a lot, and helping to look at the big picture, like, okay, if this person leaves on your team, how much is that going to cost the company to replace them? And, we can use rules of thumbs like 150% or 200% sometimes, depending on the person, of their salary, right, to replace them. That can be very costly, not to mention the time and effort from the leader, from the team for interviewing new people and, finding the right person. That can be a lot of effort. So they might realize, ooh, that's pain. I don't want to lose them. I'm going to have to figure out a way to work with them. And maybe it's not all their fault. Maybe I can do something differently too. And sometimes it's just helping them see the value of something. I guess another perspective is the black and white side of things. When you get to the data, it's either right or wrong. And when we're dealing with people issues or helping people get along better, there's a lot of gray area. And when you're looking at how people are interacting, who's right, who's wrong, it's not always that way. We have two different perspectives. And maybe there is no right answer.
maybe the best answer is for you to get along as a team. And it doesn't matter how you solve this particular problem, as long as you are all working together. There are multiple paths to get it done. So seeing that side of things as well, in addition to helping them see the numbers, but it's not always numbers. It's not always black and white. Sometimes it's the gray area as well.
Do you work with the, like say the person that you're working with, but I would assume you also work with their team to try to understand what's happening and from what those dynamics really are?
Sometimes it depends on the engagement, but sometimes I work with a full team. Sometimes I work with the individual. Oftentimes when I work with an individual, I talk to other folks in the organization. Either I talk to them or they fill out some kind of a 360-degree feedback, online survey with getting feedback from others in verbal form as well as numerical, so that we have the perspective of other people. Because when you behave in a certain way, people see it differently depending on where they are in the organization. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example, right? So if you are managing up, your leader might be looking for more business-oriented, strategic approach to solve problems. When you're managing down to your team, they might be looking for more specific instructions on something and how to do it. And so you can say the same message and people will perceive it differently because they have different needs. So that's a lot of what we talk about too, is perceptions. It's not just necessarily right or wrong. It's how people are perceiving and what their needs are and how to flex to meet those needs.
Do you get into working on language as far as, that would seem to be how people not only say it, but the words and the choices that they use? I would imagine, again, depending on who you're talking to, those words have different meanings, right?
Absolutely. I actually use language a lot because I talk to, first of all, when you want to work with technical leaders, attracting their attention is using their language, right? But also technical leaders need to use other people's languages when they want to reach outside of their organization. Now, in any field or expertise, we have our own words that we use, our jargon, you might say. Mm-hmm. Business people have a lot of jargon. Technical people just seem to have, no matter what area of software or chemical engineering. I mean, you walk into a room and you can barely understand what they're saying because it's like, I've got the XYZ working with the ABC on the MNO, and you're just like, whoa, what is all that? But so realizing that they have to find what other people can understand and what relates to them. Usually that's plain English or whatever language, but very simple words rather than trying to get too jargony.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, you did. You just freaked me out thinking of all the sessions I've been in. It's like, okay, I hear it. I don't understand the words you're saying. You're using acronyms that I don't get. I was in a meeting with a new client, actually. Well, they're a couple months old. It was interesting. We engaged in early June, but they didn't actually want me to start working directly with the team until July. And then we just actually had one of our first big meetings a few weeks ago. And when they were talking to me, the guy, he looked at me and he said, let me talk cars. You know cars? And I go, yeah, I know cars. So he said, now imagine you're a Ford, you're a Chevy. And he literally, every time they got to a technical thing, he translated it into a car analogy, which was great. I understood the other side of the coin, but it was great that it was interesting because then when people on my team were reading the notes, they were saying, okay, I get this, mm-hmm. versus I have no idea what that means. So that's really interesting. Is there a particular process that you follow? I mean, is it an assessment first or is it, conversation? I mean, how do you engage?
How do I engage with people? Typically, we have an introductory conversation. And usually when I'm working with people one-on-one or even with teams, it's important for there to be a mutually agreeable relationship, some sort of chemistry, people call it. And people have to appreciate my approach, right? And I have lots of other coaches who take a different approach, but I tend to be more tools-based. And that's one of the reasons why I tend to work with a lot of technical people because they like that, rather than more of a therapeutic approach and talking things out. I mean, obviously we talk, but we have an introductory meeting, and then usually there's an assessment, and it could be multiple assessments. But the point is for me to understand them somewhat, but also for them to gain self-awareness. So there might be the assessments on just some of their personality or skills or where they are at, but also getting some feedback from people they work with. Because as I said earlier, these perceptions can be very different. And understanding the impact a person is having on others is so much of the message that they need to hear. So we do the assessment, go through the feedback, and then we set up goals. And the goals can be usually 2 to 3 goals, not more, because that's too many. We work on a couple at a time. And they often are bigger picture goals that sort of are themes that come back from the assessment work, something that can sort of the kill 2 birds with 1 stone kind of area, that kind of a goal. And it might be that a person is finding that they have somewhat of a temper, or they're lashing out at people, and they're getting the feedback that they didn't realize that when they said something, it actually sounded harsh to other people. And they need to manage that. And they might realize that figuring out what triggers that, when are they getting the out of control response rather than a positive response, and looking for that opportunity, and then working through tools to understand that and manage the trigger could be an example of a continued coaching engagement. Teams, similarly, there are other kinds of dysfunction on teams. We have team 360s, we have team development approaches. And so usually we start with introductory, then an assessment, and then goals, and then we work through some number of sessions to meet the goals, and then move on to the next or manage out if they are satisfied.
Is there a cadence to this? Is this like a weekly occurrence?
It depends. It really depends. I have found with individuals, every 2 weeks is a good time, typically with busy leaders. Teams, sometimes it can be once a month to have times to all get together. And there's always, you'd say homework, but it's really work in between. There are assignments in between for them to apply what we're talking about in the tools that we're using.
Okay. And obviously, if there's a need, they can pick up the phone and give you a call. You're not telling them to lay down on the virtual couch while you analyze them, right?
Yep.
Now, you wrote a book, and you're writing a book. So let's talk about the book you wrote, Flying Without a Helicopter.
Okay.
And so preparing young people for work and life. I mean, I've dealt with several authors, and actually I'll call them experts, and now you're a new one for me as well. The millennial whisperers, right? And how to deal with this new workforce. And it's funny that, we spend a lot of time and people talk about, they want, candy and ice cream and bowling alleys and, all this kind of stuff. And I think some of that is true, but I find that when I work with a lot of millennials, it's a just different style of working, right? And people don't understand it. I'll say from older folks that grew up working and 24/7, and your life was your job and blah blah blah. So talk about your book. Talk about how you deal with dealing with management. That's, I assume, the management dealing with millennials and probably the Gen Z and everybody else that's kind of coming along.
Sure. Yeah. Angelo, interesting way of putting it. They want candy and ice cream. Yeah, it's funny. So the book actually came out of my consulting work with leaders. And this was, the book came out in 2015. So it's a little bit before that, just finding there were so many complaints from the leaders, so many challenges they had working with the younger generation. And there were complaints around entitlement. We've all heard these things that are sort of generalizations, that people couldn't take feedback, and the communication. Those were the 3 major ones. And at the same time, I had a daughter. I still have a daughter. She's now almost 20. But I saw what was going on at the younger phases of life and how parenting had shifted, how education had shifted. And there's so much more, I guess you would say, coddling of kids today, and reinforcing and rewarding children, and focusing on the positive. Now, there's a lot. I can go on and on about this, and I won't, Angela, but in the book, it talks a little bit about it, about why this happened, some studies that were done back in the 80s, and people sort of took off with them to build self-esteem, and how it wasn't necessarily the best approach. But our society shifted a lot. And also there was, a lot of other reasons, like 9/11, things like that. People got a little more afraid in our society. So not to blame anybody, but the reason I wrote the book is because we found that these practices for raising young people to be more disempowered and dependent on people, and when they got to the workplace, they weren't ready to run on their own. And that's why it's flying without a helicopter, right? Mm-hmm. How to jump the nest, fly the nest. And it explains a little bit about what people can do with younger folks earlier on to help them be more independent and empowered, and be resilient is another one, but also to folks who are younger themselves, young adults and managers of this next generation. Now, I have done a lot of workshops and trainings with organizations on cross-generational leadership. Right? How do you manage people across different generations? That's been an ongoing issue. In fact, even just recently, I did another one, and it just keeps coming up. It's not going away as we have these new generations coming into the workplace. And so, to answer your ultimate question, Angela, it's similar to technical leaders communicating to non-technical people. It's people of different generations communicating with each other. Mm-hmm. It is understanding how people were raised, how baby boomers were raised, why they have their values, why Gen X has their values, and millennials and Zs, and having some curiosity about that, and empathy, understanding, rather than judgment and dismissal of these different ways of being. And that's for everybody of every generation. Because I see a lot of ageism going in the other direction too, right? Some of these younger folks. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that, and probably 2015-ish, 16, that was kind of when a lot of stuff was just kind of bubbling up, and difficulty in having this new generation come in, and their demands, and their, shortness and time frames of working with the company in 90 days. It's kind of like, I think a statistic I read one time was like every 90 days they were just flipping around. And they were seeking things that were ridiculous. But when I looked at and did some of the studies, it was typically, and I hate to say boomer because I'm kind of in that realm, that it was my generation, pointing fingers and saying, well, they're just not, they don't work hard, they're not into the company, they're not doing all these things. And you have a great point. It was the ability to communicate and to understand the differences and how to find that. And I find that today. And talking to people, I have three in that generation, and one's older and one's on the younger end. So one's closer to the beginning of that era, and the other one's closer to the end of that. And it's just interesting to see the dynamics. And to your point, like the younger one, at the end of the day, he met directly and indirectly, he manages something like 150 people.
Wow.
And it's a lot. And has been on the job training. There's nobody took him aside and said, we're going to teach you how to be a great leader. It's like he's learning under fires, reading books, and he made some mistakes, we'll say, but he's learned from them. And most of the people cross-generational, some are younger than him, but they're actually people 20 years older than him that he has to deal with. And there's already a resentment of, you're young, you can't tell me you don't know. And actually my middle son just kind of ran into the same situation where he's now a leader in the company, and one of his direct reports is 20 years older, who's not happy, right, that he didn't get that job, right? So there's a lot of interesting dynamics when you think about, younger folks managing up versus, we always think of managing younger, but now you're managing up and down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's really interesting, huh?
It is interesting, and that is a predicament, and it can be uncomfortable for the younger folks to manage up to. And even having that conversation is a good place to start. Like, hey, wow, this is kind of weird. How are we going to do this? What do you think would work well? What do I think would work well? Sometimes just actually taking the elephant in the room and bringing it to the forefront and talking about it can be useful.
Is there any, I'll call them success stories, change the names to protect the innocent, but any success stories where, it's a difficult situation and what you were able to do to make that change?
Yeah. In terms of the different generations?
Or the other one. Either pick
okay.
one. I like success stories. So.
Okay, great. Well, absolutely. I love success stories. Let's see. I have a team that I worked with a couple years ago, a technical team. They were in the life sciences industry. And, there were actually generational issues there as well as the technical issues of people not communicating well. And the leader of the team had gotten this new team together who had gone through so much change. There was so much dysfunction in the team. People weren't basically talking to each other. They were avoiding it at all cost. And what we did was we helped them go in and even just get the team in a room together. Now, this was virtually. So a room is kind of like a Zoom room, or some other room you might have online. But we were using a particular tool at that time, and getting people to actually have the conversations and getting the feedback that they needed to build the trust. And it took 6 months for the team to work together and start to understand each other. And some of the things that we did weren't necessarily brain science, right? It's like having fun and games, having a little casual conversation. And they'd never taken the time to do that. They were so task focused, which is very typical of technical people. We played some games. We had video interactions. A lot of times people were avoiding that, just using audio only. And had some honest conversations. That was the other thing. We made a safe environment for them to have these conversations. And ultimately, the team got together and set up their own goals to be more communicative and have meetings on their own without me. And they were having one-on-ones with each other, the people on the team. And it was just so empowering to see them walk away from this intervention with good relationships and positive ways of interacting. And if you look at the way they measured success in the organization, they actually didn't have the numbers in terms of quantity in terms of dollars, but they ended up being the leaders in the organization of this new way of being, of bringing coaches, and presented to the entire organization and had the whole company develop a new way of managing teams. So that was a huge success story in there. It didn't have the numbers as much, but it had the impact and the reaction of the company.
Ultimately, what you were after. Yeah, listening to your story reminded me of one of my stories years and years ago at a advertising firm, and we were about 85 people, and I was probably very aggressive as a youngster, and had some conflicts with I won't say that senior leadership, but kind of the middle management leadership. And I remember complaining to my boss one time, and he basically said, called us both into his office and said, "You two go across the street to the cafe and don't come back until you work out your differences."
Yeah.
And I was like, what? That was uncomfortable. But we did actually, and we ended up having a good relationship. But, we were just put in that situation to be honest and direct with each other versus, complaining as you're walking down the hallway, which you hear all the time. One of my clients a couple of years ago, when I started getting involved, I was there for marketing, but they also had me overlook the sales department. Why? Because marketing, which what we always were fighting and trying to figure out where the problem was, and not that that was technically my job, but I needed to understand how these 7 people in one department, 12 people in another department, and there was just this conflict going back and forth. And after a few months in looking at workflow and where the hiccups came, I mean, I was able to trace it down to, frankly, 2 individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And then we figured out a way to get them to play nice together, play in the same sandbox, I would say. I had a meeting with them all, and I said, look, we're all going to play in the same sandbox together, but the first thing we need to do is get all the cat turds out.
That's so funny because technical folks tend to be extremely bright. I mean, a lot of folks are in organizations, but sometimes it's just really quick too. It doesn't have to take a long time for people to understand what they need to do differently. I actually had a conversation with somebody, one of my clients. It was 20 minutes it took for them to make a huge change in their behavior, which had a big impact. He had just started at a new organization, a different company, as a technical role, and there was somebody else who was one of his peers, and it seemed like they were tasked with some of the overlapping responsibilities. And so this other person who was at the VP level, he was not really being accessible or treating the person well, at least in his eyes, right? And so we just had this conversation about, well, do you want to work with this person? And he said, yes. I said, well, have you told him that, how much you value his input? And he said, no. And I said, well, why don't you go and have that conversation? And he literally had the conversation right after our call because he happened to have that meeting scheduled anyway. And he said that they had a 30-minute meeting. It went for an hour because they got so engaged and they were so grateful to actually hear that they appreciated each other, they wanted to work together, that they kept talking for another half an hour and then they went on. So it doesn't have to be, major intervention. It can be something small, just like you said, communicating, Angela. So much of it comes down to that.
Yeah, it really does. I did a podcast not too long ago on active listening, and I mm-hmm. believe that's a major problem with people in general, is they don't really listen. They're anticipating their next move, in a sense. It's, somebody's talking and they're not thinking about, let me ask the next question. I'm interested in what you're saying. I'm interested in telling you how I can relate to it for my own story. And mm-hmm. I find that especially in meetings, when people aren't really digging in and asking questions, but just kind of really just telling stories because they want to be involved. But at the end of the day, I just think, well, you weren't really listening to me. Yeah. So that's one of my pet peeves. It's like we're having a conversation, we're not swapping stories.
Right. I would absolutely agree. Listening is key. Also, sometimes expressing yourself. Sometimes, especially technical folks, think it's obvious. Well, it's obvious that, I want to work with them. Well, it isn't necessarily. Like in this case I was just telling you about, the mm-hmm. other guy thought he was trying to take over some of his work. But when he actually articulated, no, I want to work with you because I value your input, that's a whole different approach. And if the other person hadn't listened, like you said, it wouldn't have worked.
Yeah. Absolutely. So you have a new book coming out. I mm-hmm. think it's you're working on it, and I think you said you were scheduled sometime in the fall or January, something like that.
January, yes. Yep. So this is a book more working with the technical folks. It's called Consulting to Technical Leaders, Teams, and Organizations, Building Leadership in STEM Environments. And it's published with the American Psychological Association. It's part of the Consulting Psychology series. Nice. So it's coming out January. It's already in press, I guess you would say. They're putting it out there. It takes a while to go through all the steps, but it should be coming out in January.
Well, I mean, it's really interesting, and I want to just ask you a few more questions about that. However, I have to say, it doesn't have the catchy title that your other one does.
Yeah, I know. It's a little more on the academic side.
It's like, wow. Maybe we can create an acronym from that, and
funny.
That we might be able to utilize. But yeah, because flying without helicopter, I thought, man, I love that, and I get it. This one, I'm going, consulting with technical leaders, transforming technical leaders to managers, and it's like, wow. But
Yeah.
to your point, it's more of a scientific, technical paper in psychology. So anyway, I'm just jesting, of course. What inspires you every morning? What inspires you when you wake up?
Oh, great question. For me, it's more about the impact than anything. And over the years, I've come to realize that my impact can be small. It can be with one person at a time. And it needs to be positive impact, not just any impact, right? Because I don't want to have negative impact.
Mm-hmm.
But anything I can do to help somebody feel happier, more successful, or be more successful at their work. I actually do career coaching as well. So I work on just people finding the right fit. And I work with people in organizations to make big changes to help solve bigger problems, So for me, it inspires me to just help people be more successful at what they're trying to do.
Okay. I mean, as a psychologist, do you actually take, patients outside of dealing with organizations, or is that strictly your focus?
Now, I'm an industrial organizational psychologist, not a clinical psychologist. So I do not do therapy. I refer out. I know a lot of therapists. So when people find that they need something more serious in that domain, I definitely refer out. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Well, fantastic. If you could, I know we're kind of starting to come to an end here. If you could be speaking to my audience and maybe 2 or 3 pieces of advice or things that they should look for that are triggers that might be something that they should think about contacting you about.
Sure. So your audience might be business people who are interested in working with technical people. Mm-hmm. And so that would be my second book, on how to consult the technical people. And that would be if you're trying to attract their attention and you're not getting it, or you want to up your game to be more accessible to technical folks. Here are some ways that you can do that, some specific techniques to be more approachable to them as well as more desirable. I find a lot of technical people sort of have some insider kind of approach. They are skeptical of outsiders, so learning to speak their language. So that's one thing. If you're already in a technical organization and you're finding that some of the technical leaders are having challenges, looking for complaints from people around them, looking for if people are saying that they're being micromanaged or there's a conflict in the teams, and if the team leader is not necessarily looking for someone to help them, usually I'm a good person to come in to help them understand how they could benefit from developing some of these skills.
Okay. Have you ever worked with, I just thought of this, have you ever worked with like a technical recruiting firm that people are coming to hire technical folks, and they're kind of bringing you in, they narrow it down, they're down to the top 3 candidates, let's say, and they say, okay, I just really want to understand these people, not from their technical skill standpoint, but from their personal and their soft skills, and find the right person and have kind of a session with you to say, this person is going to be a little more difficult because blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I do assessment work. So that can be using different tools to augment the process from an objective perspective, as well as interviewing. We have, my whole team, I have others as well who help me with that, a structured interview process to help understand them. And there are a couple different things. One is, do they have some of the skills? Do they have the openness? And are they the right fit for the organization? Some environments require people to have different sort of approaches and appreciation for type of work being done. Some organizations are very competitive and ruthless. Some are very supportive and inclusive. So depending on the organization, there's a fit factor as well.
That could be interesting. I'm just thinking from a strategic standpoint for recruiting firms, if there's any recruiting firms listening today, that you become, a value add to them, another value added service that they could offer their clients. And sounds like it might make a lot of sense, because there's so many times I have recruiting friends, and they'll say, yeah, I placed somebody, and 30 days later they're getting canned because they didn't do the job or whatever it happens to be, and they just maybe didn't understand some of the personality stuff versus looking at the resume, so to speak.
Yeah. And it also helps because, a lot of companies now are trying to hire so many people, they run out of time and resources. And so, getting an external person to help with that can help them save time and be more efficient. But it also focuses on some of the things. A lot of the folks in the organizations, especially in technical organizations, focus on the technical piece. Right. And they bring in the people side too late. Yeah. So that's where I can help.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think my last question then, this is your business. You get up every day and you're servicing your clients, but you also have to keep your business going. So what keeps you up at night when you think about growing your business?
Oh, business development. Yes, of course. Getting new clients is always what keeps me up at night. And that's because, as I think a lot of people fall into this trap. I love what I do. I love engaging with clients. I feel like I'm really good at that. In terms of going out and selling, that's where I look for others to help me and do some of the marketing. But it's hard to, doing this podcast is kind of interesting too. Talking about myself for all this time is uncomfortable for me. I'm used to listening and helping others, not myself. So that's the challenge for me.
Well, look at it this way. You're helping all my listeners maybe think about their organizations and maybe some of the conflicts they might have in them, because it does happen. Even my last ad agency, the company I worked for, they bought my company, they put us together, we formed a new agency, and now I'm working with new people. And at the senior level, there was conflict unlike I had ever seen before, because it was like, well, I was a senior leader in my company, and now I'm number 4 on the list instead of number 2. And, why did you get it versus, we had all that kind of dynamic stuff going around. Get outside of the capabilities, they're fantastic, but the personality started to mesh. And in 8 years that, they never really evolved to, a very great place to work in a sense. There was always conflict for some reason or another. And I wish I knew you then. Well, thank you. This has been really interesting. I'm not sure. I think you're pretty unique for one of my guests after all this time, and it's really insightful, because I think a lot of times companies don't really address the issues at hand. They see them. I had the client I was talking about earlier, when I pointed out the absolute problem people, and they would have conversations with them, and a week later they'd be doing the same thing. And management was not, they were more concerned about that person leaving and their skill set than they were about the conflicts and the issues that were being caused inside. And I always said that is ultimately going to be a big problem.
Yeah, that's when we get into some of the figures and convincing people that keeping somebody who's valuable, who's having a negative impact on the rest of the organization, or a big part of it, is really problematic and costly. Yeah,
for sure. Well, this has been great. I want to thank you so much for your time. Why don't you tell the listeners how they can reach you, and your website, your LinkedIn, all that good stuff.
Sure. Thanks, Angelo. This has been a pleasure. You can reach me at flexibleworksolutions.com. That's my company. I also have a podcast, reinventingnerds.com, and Angelo is a guest. He had a great episode on marketing, so you can go to reinventingnerds.com as well. And LinkedIn, just look for Joanie Connell. You can find me there.
Yeah, interesting. I had a few folks email me and said, I didn't know you were a marketing nerd.
Yes.
I go, well, you know what? I've been called other things, so I'll take
Hey,
that one.
that's a term of affection and great respect.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. Yeah, you know, it's interesting. Um, I really enjoyed being on your show. It was a lot of fun, and so I'm glad we can do this kind of reciprocal thing, and I appreciate it. It's it. I know we both enjoy doing the podcast. It's you get to learn a lot of things. I mean, for me, it's about education. I mean, I learn just as much as my guests do, and so I do appreciate the time that you take out of your busy schedule. So, all right. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and we'll be seeing each other in some of the networking meetings that we belong to.
Thank you, Angelo.
All right. Take care. Joanie, I want to thank you again for stopping by the cafe today. This has been a really great conversation, and you, the listeners, have learned. If you haven't heard me on Joanie's podcast, you need to look that up as well. I'm going to put a link in the show notes and also links to her information as well. I'm glad you could join us today, and thank you for stopping by. If you're a subscriber to the show, I want to thank you. I really appreciate you continuing to listen. And if you're new to the show, or maybe it's your first time here, I encourage you to sign up to make sure that you get notified when we have new shows about all the great content that we have. As I have mentioned in previous shows, we're into our just coming out, heading towards actually, I'm in my 4th year now that I think about it. I just turned the corner. I am in my 4th year. There's 150 plus shows, a lot of great information. You can backtrack, you can listen to these, and frankly, skip watching Netflix. Forget about all that stuff. Just listen to me on the podcast. So I encourage you to do that. You can go to my website at theponzigroup.com, or you can go to the Business Growth Cafe, or frankly, on any podcast platform you like to listen to, you can find the Business Growth Cafe. So thank you again for stopping by. I look forward to seeing you and talking to you next week here on the Business Growth Cafe.
Thank you for listening to today's discussion at the Business Growth Cafe with your host, Angelo Ponzi. Take a moment to subscribe to this podcast and visit our website at www.businessgrowthcafe.com. Read Angelo Ponzi's blogs at www.theponzigroup.com.